Hello and welcome everyone to today's webinar, Use of LCA in North American Policy. I am your host, Sam Boduk, Account Manager here at Earthshift Global, and we are very fortunate today to be featuring two Earthshift Global leaders, including Lisa Lauren, Earthshift Global's founder and CEO, and Nathan Ayer, Earthshift Global's Director of Research. Today's webinar will discuss two North American policies, the Canadian Clean Fuel Standard and the U.S. Internal Revenue Service sections 45Q and 45V, and how life cycle greenhouse gas accounting is a key aspect to both. It's sure to be both instructional and informative. And we will welcome Q&A using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Feel free to submit questions as the presentation goes on. Without further ado, I am excited to welcome Lisa and Nathan. Lisa, please take it away.
Thank you so much, Sam. As Sam said, I'm Lisa Lauren, and I'm really pleased to present to you this little bit of a dive into the IRS sections 45Q and 45V. Nathan's going to take the Clean Fuel Standard and what's involved in that. If you are here because you're interested in North American LCA and North American policy outside of these few regulations, this probably isn't the webinar for you. But if you're interested in these, then we're going to go into it a little bit and do even a little bit of a hands-on kind of a thing as well. So I want to start with the Inflation Reduction Act, which made changes to the 45Q and introduced the 45V. And in very many ways, if you look at the Inflation Reduction Act, it didn't have much to do with inflation reduction, but it had a lot to do with greenhouse gas reduction and moving us from where we are today, hopefully to a lower carbon future. It provides investments in a bunch of different things, alternative fuel, including aviation fuel, clean energy production and storage, and some of these were changes to existing regulations, and some of these are new. Alternative energy production, hydrogen for industrial heat and transportation, carbon sequestration and reuse, alternative vehicles, and home energy efficiency. And of those, the ones that are highlighted require an LCA of some kind, a life cycle assessment or a greenhouse gas assessment, if you will, a life cycle greenhouse gas assessment, to show the emission rates in order to get the credit. It is a credit from the IRS, and that's what that is offering. So we're going to focus back. We're going to focus on the 45V and the 45Q, as I said. So let's start with section 45V. This has to do with the production of hydrogen, and it applies to hydrogen that from a well-to-gate perspective, and that means from raw material extraction through the production of the hydrogen, it has a carbon footprint of less than 4 kilograms of CO2 equivalent per kilogram of hydrogen. To put that in a bit of context, traditional steam reforming is on the order of 10 to 12 kilograms of CO2 equivalent per kilogram of hydrogen. And EcoInvent is showing something on the order of 1.3 to 1.7 kilograms per CO2 equivalent for hydrogen from petroleum processing. So it needs to be cleaner than traditional steam reforming, but there are processes other than electrolysis that can create that. However, the lower the greenhouse gas emissions you have, the higher the credit. The regulation and the The guidance around the regulation is currently in public comment period. So when I get into the tool, for example, and show you some things, there may be some things that you want to comment on. That's closing February 26th. So there is some time pressure on that. But it's a good opportunity to get your thoughts into this regulation. There's credit for up to 10 years of operation. The hydrogen has to be produced in the US. It does require external verification of your production amounts. It does not require a certification or a verification or a critical review of the LCA. In fact, the LCA, as you'll see in a minute, is pretty easy. Or I should say, not easy, but straightforward. If you've ever taken a 45Q credit for the carbon sequestration or reuse, you cannot take a 45V. They are mutually exclusive, although you can take the clean energy production of power. In fact, you don't even have to sell the power. You can use your own power and claim the clean energy credits for those. So you can double count with the power, but you can't double count with the 45Q, if you will. The credit value is, if you're looking at your emissions reduction, if you're just below that 4, then you are going to get 12 cents per kilogram. If you are meeting a higher standard in terms of the facility and labor, then you can get up to 5 times that. If you have a little bit better, then you get more, and all the way up to $3, which is not bad. In order to get the credit, you have to use this tool called the 45VH2 GREET model. This has come out of Argonne National Labs and is built on GREET. And so this is what is required to be used. It's interesting that it's not the most current of GREET model available when you're doing your taxes, which is when you have to have this, but it's what is available when you're actually doing the production of the hydrogen that you're going to take the credit on. Obviously, you can't do the calculation until after that year is complete, that fiscal year is complete, unless you're only going to do for a partial year. So you're going to have to go back probably to prior versions. And so they have a website set up that's got the current, previous, and updated versions of GREET at this website. You're going to want to include your emissions associated with feedstock growth, hydrogen production, inclusive of the energy production, and any capture and sequestration of the carbon dioxide that's generated. There's a lot of documentation as to how to do it, but again, the tool is pretty straightforward and walks you through it. And that tool is pretty fixed. You can't do much change in it. And just for knowledge of those who do lots of LCA, the allocation is primarily through system expansion. So the GREET pathways that are currently in the tool: methane reforming, autothermal reforming, SMR, ATR, both of landfill gas, coal gasification, biomass gasification with corn stover and logging residue, and then 2 types of electrolysis, low temperature and high temperature. If you have a different pathway, then you don't use the this tool. You're going to use the traditional GREET model to do that, and then you have to petition for a provisional emission rate from that. Presumably, once you've petitioned for that, the folks at Argonne will hopefully add that to the tool, so in the future you can just use the tool. So before I move on to the 45Q, let me show you the tool. I had hoped actually that I would be able to show you the tool and then just work on it. Just I'm going to move it over here for you. So when you come into the user inputs tab, you're going to see your simulation year and then those pathways that we just talked about. So you're going to pick one of each of these. It takes about 5 minutes just to pick them. So I'm instead going to grab a model that I've pre-built a little bit with the electrolysis. So this is with low temperature electrolysis. I've got a grid mix coming from New England. I've got an oxygen co-product. I've got some hydrogen coming out with the production pressure. And then the emissions, so the result that you're going to put in is down here at the bottom, the kilograms of CO2 equivalent that you can put in. So that's what it looks like there. If I go then to, see if I can get to the right one here. Sorry, I've got a lot of things open because I can't actually do the work in it. So here's one with biomass gasification. Oops, hang on. There we go. So here, choose the biomass gasification, then you have to click the enter process details, and then you're going to you can put your biomass, electricity, and natural gas in here. Again, you can pick your electricity mix, pick whether you're doing any CO2 capture and storage, then put your hydrogen amount that's coming out. And you'll find that, for example, if you want to have custom feedstock properties, that you're going to have to wait a while for something else to pop up. Each time that you push a button or you enter a value, it takes time for the system to come out, which is okay, right? You only have to do it once and then put your taxes in. Just be prepared that it's a slow process. Pretty easy, but a slow process. Okay. Let's go back to the slideshow. We can pull that up. And let's talk a little bit about the 45Q. In the case of 45Q, we are looking at having lower emissions than the market supply. So one of the things you'll have to do is find out what the market supply is and model it, and then make sure that your emissions are lower than those. Once you've determined that you are lower, you can use the CO2 for a lot of things, and it doesn't really matter. Although if you're using it as an ejectant in an enhanced oil and natural gas recovery project, there's a different amount. There's also a different amount if you're actually taking CO2 out of the atmosphere rather than taking it from a process that's producing it. So there is a higher value for that sequestration part. The credit is based on cradle to gate emissions, less that market supply, so that difference. In this case, the LCA does have to be reviewed, so you do have to have a bit of a critical review. And another piece of that is that transport of the CO2 to the next user is not included. So you're really going to your own gate, and it really doesn't matter what it's used for, as long as it's used. It does have to be used. So there are a bunch of tools available. National Technology Labs has created two, one of which I'm going to show you, which is an Excel tool that you can use called CO2U. So I'll show you that in a minute. There's also an open LCA tool produced by Nettle. And if you like to work in open LCA, I think that's probably your best bet. Both of these, however, are not just for 45Q. So you need to read the documentation that goes around these in order to really understand how to use those tools. We have also built a pretty simple tool for estimating your credit, just to see, is there a possibility you're going to get any money? Is it worth it? And so that estimator is available from our website, and I'll show you all of these all except the Open LCA tool in just a minute. The data in that estimator is all coming from that documentation spreadsheet, the Excel Nettle tool, and also there's some from Greet. So that our tool is not for generating the results or submitting the credit. The other tools are. Ours is just for quick and dirty. Does it make any sense to invest any money in doing the LCA? So let me see if I can pull the right documents up now. So this one. This is basically an example input page from the Nettle tool. And you'll see we have a main co-product. In the case of a 45Q, you're going to put your CO2 in here. Then your other products, your other co-products, are going to be down here. And you're going to want to capture all of these because the allocation is by mass, and you want to make sure that you're reducing the impact as much as possible of your CO2. Then we have the inputs and outputs. We have different electricity we can put in, different materials and water that you can put in, and then you can put in the amount for your data boundary. And then you can see the units here, and then that brings us up to the units per year. And eventually it will get you to your carbon. So that's it's a pretty interesting tool, pretty good tool that you can use to estimate your impacts. And then let me show you real quick the tool that we put together. Similar kind of thing, except that now we have our main product is already labeled CO2. You're going to put your amount, how much is biogenic, and then you're going to put your co-products in here. You're going to want to put your material inputs, your electricity inputs, and you'll just select them from a drop down here. So you can just grab where your material inputs are coming from. You might also pick your electricity, other energy. So if you're using some natural gas, for example, on any raw material transport, everything on the left-hand side is allocated per product and co-product, whereas on the right-hand side, all of this, because this is for purification and compression, this only applies to the CO2. So all of these impacts are going to be associated with the CO2. And then your results show over here in the right, and it will actually show the value. This will give you the dollars that you're going to potentially get. And again, it's a very rough calculator, but gives you a rough idea. Does it make any sense for me to go after this? The last thing is As I said, the CO2 is treated as a co-product, so the impacts of manufacturing it do show in right. You have to include those as part of it, which is interesting because if you have a very dirty facility, you're not going to get a lot of credit, and you may not bother to capture it. Where a little bit of my philosophy is, let's just capture it all. So let's have an incentive to capture it all. But I didn't get my comments in time, and so that didn't get included in the regulation. My fault. With that, I'm going to close and turn this over to Nathan. Looks like we've already got a bunch of questions, so I'll let Nathan do his part, and hopefully we'll have lots of time for questions after. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to share my screen separately. Lisa, if you can stop sharing yours. Great. Thank you for that, Lisa. Thank you for everyone who's joined. We're excited to have you here. We'll shift now into something related, but also very different. I think the reason why we wanted to offer this webinar is that as these government regulatory programs emerge, one of the clear things is that there is no single modeling tool. There is no single approach for estimating greenhouse gas emissions across the life cycle and greenhouse gas emissions reductions. Anyone who is on the webinar who is a low carbon or renewable fuel producer, you will know that as you go into different jurisdictions, you're being asked to use different modeling tools, use different assumptions, different data. So just getting comfortable with this emerging landscape is important, and there's a lot of challenges to it. You might ask, who are we to speak about the Canadian Clean Fuel Regulation? There is a large team dedicated to this program at Environment and Climate Change Canada. Earthshift Global, I'm proud to say, was part of a consulting team who developed the initial life cycle greenhouse gas emissions models for Canadian fuels, which are now being used as part of that program, which I will be focusing on today. And in recent years, we've been working with a number of clients who are trying to navigate this emerging space. And we've learned some lessons along the way. So my objective for my little bit of time today is to give you an overview of the Clean Fuel Regulation, spend some time showing you the fuel LCA modeling tool, which is very different from what Lisa was just showing you for the 45Q programs, give you a bit of an idea of how that tool is structured, and how can someone participate in this program in terms of how do you actually calculate your carbon intensity for a fuel and submit it to the Clean Fuel Regulation Program. So just as a sort of higher level overview, the Canadian Clean Fuel Regulation is a set of legislation programs, and importantly for today, a life cycle based modeling approach for Canadian fuels. The objective being to, over time, reduce the carbon intensity of fossil fuels that are produced and used in Canada, and to ramp up the production of clean or renewable or low carbon intensity fuels as substitutes for fossil fuels in the fossil fuel industry and in the broader transportation and energy markets. So there's two mechanisms at play in the Clean Fuel Regulation. One is that it is now in Canadian legislation that Canadian fossil fuel producers of particularly gasoline and diesel are now mandated to reduce the carbon intensity of their fuels gradually over time, working towards a total reduction of 15% by 2030 relative to 2016 levels. And so the requirement for this first year, for 2023, is to reduce by 3.5 grams of CO2 per megajoule, and then increasingly another 1.5 grams of CO2 each year up until 2030. This program also, the other primary mechanism is the establishment of a credit market for low carbon fuels, where regulated producers can create or buy credits to comply with these reduction targets, and where low carbon fuel producers can participate in this program by having more opportunities to supply their fuels to this market. Compliance credits under the CFR can be generated a few different ways. The first is by regulated producers undertaking projects that reduce the CI of their liquid fossil fuels, so adopting carbon capture and storage, switching to renewables on site, etc. A second way is to supply low carbon intensity fuels, so things like ethanol and biodiesel and potentially hydrogen. And then the third way, supplying fuel or energy to advanced vehicle technologies, so getting into electric or hydrogen powered vehicles. There's a whole well-established system called the the CFR credit and tracking system. We're not going to go into details on some of these more legislative and programmatic aspects of the CFR today, but lots of documentation available and a well-established system of tracking, recording, and compiling these credits. A formal system of verification has been established by Environment and Climate Change Canada, based heavily on the ISO LCA standards and the critical review approach within ISO. And additionally, a series of quantification methods has also been published to support modeling carbon intensity for some specific fuel pathways. So I just said the term fuel pathway. What does that mean under the CFR? Here's a visual representation. The CFR takes a life cycle approach to estimating, tracking, and reducing the carbon intensity of Canadian fuels. So under the CFR, carbon intensity is expressed in grams of CO2 per megajoule at high heating value for the life cycle of a fuel, starting from feedstock production through transportation, fuel production, fuel distribution, and then fuel combustion. So when I use the term pathway today, or when you're hearing the term pathway and interacting with the CFR, a fuel pathway includes these life cycle stages from raw material extraction through to final combustion of the fuel by the end user. Under the CFR and in the legislation and in the tool that I'm going to show you today, a number of default carbon intensity values have already been generated by Environment and Climate Change Canada for a range of existing fossil fuels and also life cycle activities involved in the life cycle of different fuels, including fossil fuels and low carbon fuels. So in the tool that we're going to look at today and in the legislation, you will find predetermined carbon intensity values for different types of liquid, gaseous, and solid fuels, extraction and production of feedstocks, supply chain transportation, other steps in the process like liquefaction and compression of fuels, combustion of both types of fuel, and electricity generation. But these default CI values don't capture all possibilities. They don't capture all possible fuel pathways, and they don't necessarily capture all of the upstream activities that might be involved in specific fuel pathways that you as a producer might have as part of your life cycle. So the ultimate question for the CFR is how can the life cycle carbon intensity of fossil fuels, low carbon fuels, and the supporting processes be estimated in a way that's representative, consistent, and transparent? And the answer to that was the development of the Fuel LCA model. So Environment and Climate Change Canada has developed a model that is based in the Open LCA software platform that participants in the program can use to estimate the life cycle carbon intensity of fuels and energy sources that are used and produced in Canada. So this is a publicly available modeling tool. It's in OpenLCA, which is a free software platform that you can download. And the Fuel LCA model generally consists of a library of predefined processes that you can use to build models, a library of what they call configurable low carbon fuel pathways. So some basically like the schematic of the life cycle of common low carbon fuel pathways that you can use in modeling, and then impact assessment methods for calculating carbon intensity that are based on the IPCC characterization factors. And as of the most recent update, you can use both the AR5 and AR6 characterization factors in the tool. So this tool is publicly available. Important to note, I think, that its use is not limited to just people looking to participate in the CFR. Because it's publicly available, it can also be used by consultants and academics and NGOs. So it's there for wide use if people desire. Environment and Climate Change Canada has done a very nice job of providing really detailed documentation of the methodological approach that was used to develop the tool, to fully document the data and the assumptions that were used, and also good guidance documents and tutorials on how to use the tool. So in particular, the Fuel LCA model methodology report, there's also a user manual and some pre-recorded tutorials that you can view. So there's lots of support and guidance available on how to use the tool. So in order to get access to the OpenLCA Fuel LCA model, you need to go to the CFR website where you can, well, actually, first you need to download the OpenLCA software platform. Then you go download the Fuel LCA model database, and then import that database into the Fuel LCA model. And there's some good instructions available at the link I've provided here on how you can follow through the steps in order to be able to do that. So what I thought I would do is sort of jump out of my presentation and show you a little bit of what's inside the OpenLCA tool, how it's structured, and a couple of examples of things that you can do in the tool. So very different user interface than what you just saw with Lisa, looking at the Excel-based tools. OpenLCA is a long-standing, quite a software tool that allows quite complex analysis. So that it's a fairly advanced LCA software tool. So not the same user interface, not a web-based tool. It's a desktop tool primarily. So it's not a drag and drop environment. It's what I would call sort of more of an engineering simulation type tool. So the platform itself is what you see here. And on the left here are different databases. So the Fuel LCA model is downloaded as a database, which you import into OpenLCA. And then within the database are the different things that you need to be able to model the carbon intensity of a given fuel pathway. So I'll focus in on a couple of key areas. The first is a data library. So this is a collection of data sets that you can use to build models. So this includes commonly used material and energy inputs that would go into the life cycle of a fuel. So we have chemical inputs, we have electricity options, we have different feedstocks, we have fossil fuels. Important to note that the carbon intensity for fossil fuels has been determined by Environment and Climate Change Canada and also published in the legislation. So the carbon intensity of these fuels is built into these processes, and we'll take a look at one in a moment. And then we also have some renewable fuels and different transportation options available. So things like pipelines, trains and trucks and tanker transport. So meant to give you kind of the basic building blocks that you would need to build a life cycle greenhouse gas emissions model for a low carbon fuel. Just to show you a bit of what's inside of these processes. So if we look at fossil fuels, for example, and we look at something like diesel, what you'll find when you open one of these processes is lots of documentation about how these were created, some of the assumptions, some of the data sets that were used to generate the process. When you go to the inputs and outputs, what you'll note for these processes that are in the data library is that they do not have material and energy inputs. They simply have the outputs of greenhouse gas emissions, which make up the carbon intensity for this particular process. So this is for the life cycle carbon intensity of diesel from extraction all the way through to combustion. For these predetermined processes, you can calculate the carbon intensity very quickly. So here my carbon intensity for this diesel is 92.3 grams of CO2, and I can see the contribution of the different greenhouse gases that are emitted over the course of the life cycle. So beyond the data library, we also have a set of configurable fuel pathways for low carbon fuels. So you can use these pathways, as I said before, they're kind of a schematic for a life cycle model for a particular low carbon fuel. So if we look at something like biodiesel, these are broken down according to life cycle stage. And they basically are places where if the schematic for this particular fuel lines up with your fuel production process, you can open these processes and enter your data into them. So this kind of gives you a starting point where if you don't really know how to start in terms of configuring the life cycle of a model, the fuel LCA model gives you these sort of blueprints that you can follow. Now that's not going to work for everybody, but here you see that these processes are basically empty, so there are places where you can enter your data. The other thing to note in the tool is the impact assessment methods, where you can go and you can review the characterization factors that are used for impact assessment. So the AR6 is the most recent that was added, and you can actually go in and see what are the characterization factors that are used for different greenhouse gases. One other thing to show you while we're in here is to look at some other analyses. So what I was playing around with earlier was looking at some recently added predefined fuel pathways, which you see here. So there's some for biodiesel, bioethanol, and hydrogen. And I was just sort of analyzing them to see, for some of them, how does the carbon intensity vary if we have different allocation, for example. So in the predefined pathways, there's a biodiesel CI from canola oil with an energy-based allocation and a mass-based allocation. So when you do an analysis in OpenLCA, this is just a quick example of the kind of outputs that you can get. So you get some different graphical representations of the results for the carbon intensity. You can look at an inventory based on elementary flows. You can also look at different ways of looking at the contribution of different parts of the life cycle. So here we're looking at biodiesel, and we can see what percentage does the upstream production contribute to the overall carbon intensity, what does the distribution contribute, etc. So here we see on an energy-based allocation, we have a CI of 28.7 grams, basically. And if we look at a mass-based allocation, let's see what we get. Now we get a CI of about 23.8 grams of CO2. So allocation, always an important determinant of something like carbon intensity. So that's just a quick view of what's in the tool. So I just want to finish off by talking a little bit about how do you actually participate and use this model? How do you actually submit data? And I think most importantly, how do you submit data or on the CI of your fuel if your fuel doesn't match what's already in the OpenLCA tool, which is going to be the case for a lot of people. So using the fuel LCA model to estimate carbon intensity, anyone participating in the CFR must use the fuel LCA model, either by using existing CIs for pathways that are built into the model, or by using the fuel LCA model to build a new fuel pathway. And we'll talk a bit in a moment about that process. There's good guidance provided, so you must follow the specifications for fuel LCA model CI calculations. And there's also a data workbook that is supposed to be used to prepare your data for modeling. And this is the workbook. I won't spend too much time in here, but this needs to be completed and submitted along with your fuel LCA model from OpenLCA. So one of the objectives of the workbook is to make sure that everyone is using the same conversion factors, the same high heating values, the same energy densities, so that we have a fair level playing field for these models. So in this workbook, there's places for you to enter data for the different steps in the life cycle. So for your feedstocks and then getting into production, distribution, and combustion. Also important to note for the fuel LCA model is that Environment and Climate Change Canada are providing regular updates to the data that are available and to the fuel pathways that are available in the model. So there are some scheduled updates. There also will be unscheduled updates at times when it becomes necessary to correct errors or address, significant issues identified by stakeholders. There's a process for getting a new fuel pathway applied. I think this will be a very commonly used part of the CFR because many people have, specific novel fuel pathways and production technologies. And the data just may not be there in the OpenLCA tool to properly represent your pathway. So there's a formal process in place for submitting a new pathway for approval. You must get approval from Environment and Climate Change Canada for a new pathway for you to be able to use it as a submission and for other fuel producers to be able to use your fuel in a fuel switching scenario. So some of the requirements are to provide a data quality assessment, a plan to collect verifiable data and results. The modeling has to be done in a way that's conformant with the ISO standards. You must provide the workbook as well as an OpenLCA model and go through this approval process. Other things to note around submitting a CI application is that is data requirements. So an approved CI requires 24 months of consecutive input data for a specified fuel pathway. There are alternatives if you don't have that level of data. So you can use some of the predefined or default CI values on an interim basis until you have enough data, or you can apply for temporary CIs using the fuel LCA model. A few other quick methodological considerations. So the fuel LCA model was designed to conform with the ISO standards. Functional unit is 1 megajoule of energy content based on high heating value, delivered to the end user and combusted. Results are expressed in grams of CO2 per megajoule. The model doesn't account for things like construction and decommissioning and infrastructure, waste management, water management, or indirect land use change. In terms of co-product allocation, which Lisa talked about a bit, the default allocation in the fuel LCA model is by energy content. There are a few processes allocated on a mass basis, such as wood fiber, animal fat, and oil from oil seeds. System expansion is also used in some cases where waste materials are used that could result in avoided methane emissions. The cutoff approach is used when wastes are used as inputs or feedstocks, so they carry no upstream burdens for things like used cooking oil and animal fats. Biogenic CO2 emissions from low carbon fuels are set to zero. CO2 emissions due to changes in tillage practices and summer fallow area for crops are included, but indirect land use change effects are not currently included. So, Lisa, I don't know if you want to rejoin me for a moment or two, but we just wanted to end on a couple of points of advice. So, a couple of reflections on the fuel LCA model in particular. If you're looking to engage with this process with the CFR, I think it's first important to confirm if your fuel pathway can actually be modeled in the existing fuel LCA model with the data and processes available, or if you will need to get a new pathway approved. That's going to be some additional work and an additional step. I highly recommend reaching out to contacts at Environment and Climate Change Canada for support. They're being very proactive and helpful in this process, and it may be easier to get your questions answered that way. You should consider if you can do this modeling work internally. OpenLCA is not quite as straightforward as some of the tools that Lisa was showing you, but with a bit of time spent, you can figure out how to work with it. But if you're going to need external support, you want to factor that into your planning in terms of the time and resources needed. And also just recommend keeping track of ongoing updates from Environment and Climate Change Canada to the data, to the methods, to the available fuel pathways. So just a couple of overall bits of advice from me, and Lisa, you can add to this if you wish. I think it's important to understand your team's technical capabilities and limitations, to work early on data collection, identifying data and modeling gaps in the required tools. It's great to use the available tools to do some early estimates, as Lisa mentioned, to understand if this is actually a worthwhile effort to pursue. Are you going to be able to achieve significant enough reductions to really benefit from this process? Aiming to be flexible, as I said off the top, depending on the jurisdiction in which you might sell your fuel, you may have to use one of half a dozen or more tools to calculate carbon intensity, as well as different data and modeling assumptions. So remaining flexible as you might shift into different programs is important, and reaching out to program operators for guidance to point you towards resources and to make sure that you're following the right procedures.
I think that really says it. Nathan, I think you've captured a lot. Yeah, then we've got a lot of questions.
Wonderful. Thank you both. And thank you both for that wonderful presentation. And thank you, listening audience, for all the great questions I see. I see that we have piqued a bit of curiosity around all that was discussed. The first question that I see in the list is, can you elaborate on how you think the PER process will work? Do you envision that applicants will need to submit an LCA, or will the team at ANL, which I presume is Argonne National Lab, will do the LCA as part of the process? I believe that would go to you, Lisa.
Yeah, you're going to need to do your own LCA. You're going to need to do it and greet, and then submit that, and then it will be reviewed, I'm guessing, by Argonne, and then later approved. So yeah, you're going to have to do the LCA, unfortunately.
Thanks, Lisa. And a question to the audience before I forget. We would like to know, if you want to drop a note in the Q&A, if you have actually gotten a 45Q credit, please just drop a note in the Q&A saying that you have received a 45Q credit. And maybe we can have you join in via audio to tell us about your experience. The next question I have
on that, we've gotten the question before from potential clients if anyone's ever gotten one, and we have worked with clients who have gotten them, so they are doable.
For you, Nathan, I see that another question specific for Canada CFR is for the fuel LCA model, is the version of the model which includes the AR6 indicators publicly available?
Yes. In fact, I downloaded those yesterday. So I believe, I would assume if you download a fresh version of the database today, it will have those included, but I can't guarantee that. I downloaded them as a separate file, which I imported. So on the Fuel LCA model website, there's about half a dozen new additions, which are going to be in a future version, I think, of the database, but they're offered sort of in advance so that people can use them and test them. So yesterday I downloaded about 6 different files, including those AR6 characterization factors, and I imported them into my database.
Great, thanks. I believe the next question is for Lisa. Did you notice if any of the electricity requirements for the electrolysis include balance of plant or energy required to purify the water?
So that's part of the analysis that you're going to have to do. You're going to have to understand what is the energy required to purify the water and include it in that electricity. So you're going to need to include that yourself.
Great, thank you. And related to 45V as well, for hydrogen, does 45V deal with hydrogen carrier liquids such as formic acid?
So there's no formic acid right now in the tool that you could use to create hydrogen or use to carry it for other processes. So if you were to claim credit for that, you would have to go through that PER process and do that. And you would really have to be able to be providing heat through the carrier in order to claim the credit. It's really for alternative forms of heat energy for mostly for chemical production is the goal of this, is to replace fossil fuels for that.
Great, thank you, Lisa. Just to balance the questions, Canadian and US, I'll throw it out to Nathan as well. First off, thank you, Nathan. How do we know the material and energy inputs used in the library?
Yeah, great question. So when I was showing you the data library, what I pointed out was that all you can see in those library processes is the greenhouse gas emissions. You can't see how much electricity went in, or how much of a chemical, or how much different materials went in. So in OpenLCA, you can't see it. There is an extensive background document provided by Environment and Climate Change Canada, which shows the background modeling approaches, and I believe quite a bit of the inventory data for things that are in the data library. Some of that data where it's confidential, you won't be able to see, but in that background report, you should be able to get a general sense of what's going into those. But in the tool itself, you can't actually see that.
Thank you, Nathan. Another question for Lisa. Do the metal OpenLCA databases rely on another background database, for example, EcoInvent, or is it complete?
It is complete. Well, I shouldn't say complete. It has what it has in it, and you can use those data. It does have basically the same kind of data as I showed you in the Excel tool that you can combine in different ways. If you need additional data, then for 45Q, you are allowed to use EcoInvent data. So bring the results into OpenLCA. But yeah, it's essentially it's a limited database, complete as much as that Excel tool is complete.
Another question is, what is the difference between the predefined pathways and the pathways in the data library?
I think
that's a Canada question. So yeah, there's the predefined pathways are pathways where Environment and Climate Change Canada analysts have included actual data, so that those predefined pathways, you can leave them as they are and you can calculate carbon intensity directly for them. There's also what are called configurable pathways, which are the ones I was describing as kind of a framework or a schematic for different fuel pathways that don't have any data in them. They're just set up with the proper life cycle structure that would, typically be used to model that type of fuel. So for those ones, there's no data. So if you were to analyze them, you would get 0 carbon intensity because there's nothing in there to run the model on. So the configurable ones are for you to enter your own data. The predefined have default, average data, so that if you have nothing else to work with, you can still get a CI. And those carbon intensities are listed in some of the schedules to the actual legislation. And they're there so that for people who want to participate in the CFR who have not yet calculated their CI and don't have the data can use these predefined CIs so that they can still be part of the program while they gather data, their own data for their process over time.
Great, thanks, Nathan. Lisa, there was a question on how does the 45Q tool work? I believe that there are instructions on the website we have listed. Perhaps we'll schedule another webinar for a tutorial of the 45Q calculator as well. Another question, I believe it goes to Nathan, is the cutoff approach applicable to wood waste?
Great question. So what's available in the current fuel LCA model is sawmill waste and wood chips from unmerchantable wood. So the sawmill waste is treated as a co-product as opposed to a cutoff approach. So it actually includes allocated upstream impacts from forestry, sawmilling, and supply chain transportation. So other forms of wood waste were not really considered. So, some of the other things like bark and things like that you get out of a sawmill, or I don't think are really in the current version of the model. But the other one, and the wood chips one, is treated as a co-product as well.
However, in the nettle tool, forest residue is treated as under cutoff, so it has no impact. So it is a difference in philosophy between Canada and the US there.
Thanks for that differentiation. We are about at time, and I think we have to close the Q&A right there. There are a few remaining questions. We will do our best in the coming days to address those questions and actually send out a follow-up email with a link to the recording to this webinar. Thank you again, Lisa and Nathan. This is such a wonderful presentation. As we wrap up this webinar, I just want to remind the listening audience that the 2 experts that you just heard are part of a broader Earthshift Global team. We are here to support all of your sustainability needs. Please do reach out if you have a need that we can help you out with. Last, you can also stay up to date on all upcoming webinars and Earthshift Global happenings by subscribing to our monthly e-newsletter known as The Shift by visiting www.earthshiftglobal.com/newsletters. Thank you all for your time and attention today, and we wish you a wonderful rest of your day. Thanks, everyone.